The day had begun like any other on the royal cruiser. The sun was setting on the distant horizon of the newly discovered planet, casting a soft orange glow over the metallic surface of the ship. On board, everything was calm. Serene, even. The crew moved efficiently through their tasks, and the quiet hum of the engines was a constant, comforting sound. But for the security officer, it was another routine day. He had worked in the Royal Guard for years, and to him, protecting the Queen was just a part of the job. She was a figure of immense power, a symbol of their kingdom. But to him, she was just another person who needed to be kept safe. He wasn't looking for recognition or fame. He simply did his job. He stood at his post near the Queen's quarters, watching the bustling crew members as they prepared for the evening's gathering. The Queen, as usual, had been busy in her chambers, making final preparations for an important diplomatic event. The details of the event didn't matter much to the officer. His focus was always on ensuring her safety. He was trained for this, and he knew that even on peaceful days like this, something could go wrong. The world of politics was never as quiet as it seemed. A soft knock on his earpiece startled him. "Status update?" came the voice of the commander over the comms. He responded with the usual brief report. "Everything's clear, Commander. No sign of any threats." He glanced over at the Queen's guards as they conducted their patrols. "All security checks are in place." "Good," the commander replied. "Just stay alert, we can't take any chances." He nodded, though no one could see him. The routine made him feel a little too comfortable. Maybe that was his mistake. He didn't think much about it. Life was calm. The Queen was safe. Then, everything changed in an instant. The quiet hum of the ship was shattered by a deafening explosion. The walls shook violently and the lights flickered before the emergency alarms blared, flooding the corridors with an urgent red glow. The officer's heart raced. His training kicked in almost immediately. He ran toward the sound of the explosion, his mind already calculating the danger. The Queen's quarters were just ahead. His hand went instinctively to the weapon at his side as he rounded the corner. Another explosion, this time closer. The floor trembled beneath his feet as the ship's systems scrambled to contain the breach. He could hear shouting and scrambling ahead. His heart pounded in his chest. There was no time for hesitation. He burst into the corridor leading to the Queen's chambers just in time to see a group of armed assailants storming down the hall. They were fast, coordinated. The officer's eyes locked onto the Queen, who stood in front of her chambers, unaware of the danger coming her way. He had no time to think. Without a second thought, he threw himself toward her, pushing her to the ground as the sound of gunfire split the air. The pain hit almost immediately. His body absorbed the force of the blast meant for her. The shot tore through his side, and he collapsed, the world spinning around him. The Queen's voice reached his ears, filled with panic. "No!" she cried out, her hands shaking as she tried to stem the blood flow from his wound. But it was no use. The world around him was fading. He heard more footsteps, the sound of people rushing toward them. The Queen's guards had arrived. The assailants were subdued quickly, but the officer's vision blurred as he struggled to stay conscious. The Queen was still beside him, her breath quick and frantic as she knelt next to him, her hand clutching his arm. "Stay with me," she whispered. Her voice trembled. "Please, stay with me." He tried to speak, to reassure her, but his breath was shallow. Every movement felt like 1,000 needles piercing his body. It was hard to focus, harder still to stay awake. "Protect, protect," he muttered, his voice barely audible. Her expression softened, the worry in her eyes so raw that it made his heart ache. But it was too much. The darkness was pulling at him, threatening to take him under. The last thing he saw before his vision closed was her face, her mouth moving as she spoke urgently into her communicator. But he couldn't hear her words anymore. Everything was fading. The officer awoke some time later in a medical bay. The pain was still there, but it was more distant now, replaced by an overwhelming sense of confusion. His eyes fluttered open, and the first thing he noticed was the Queen. She was sitting beside him, her presence so calm and comforting that it almost didn't feel real.
"You're awake?" she said softly.
Her voice was quiet, but he could hear the relief in it. She wasn't sitting far away, as most royals would. She wasn't standing above him like a distant leader. No, she was right there, by his side, watching him closely. He blinked, trying to clear his head. "Your Majesty, what happened?" "You saved my life," she replied, her eyes filled with an emotion he didn't expect, concern. It wasn't the cold, regal composure she was known for. There was vulnerability in her gaze. He shook his head weakly. "I just did my job." The Queen didn't respond right away. Instead, she reached for a cloth and gently wiped his forehead, her touch tender, unlike anything he had ever felt from her. There was a silence between them, the kind that was full of unspoken words. She didn't need to say it. He knew that she was grateful. He'd been the one to throw himself in front of the bullets meant for her, and now, here he was, recovering in the medical bay because of it. "You've been here for hours," the Queen finally said. "I wasn't sure you'd wake up." The officer gave a small, strained smile. "I'm still here." She nodded, looking at him with a mixture of respect and something else. Something deeper. "You didn't have to do it, you know." "I would again," he said, his voice steady despite the weakness in his body. "I would always do it." She held his gaze for a long moment before her lips curled into a faint smile. "I'll make sure your bravery is known to the people. You'll be remembered for this." He wanted to say more, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he closed his eyes, letting the exhaustion take over once more. But this time, it wasn't the pain that filled his thoughts. It was the Queen, sitting beside him, a silent promise lingering in the air between them. The days following the assassination attempt were a blur. The officer was still in the medical bay, his body healing slowly. But the pain never fully left. Every time he tried to sit up or move, he felt the sting of the injury, but his thoughts were never on the pain. They were always on the Queen. The Queen had stayed by his side, as she had promised. He had woken several times to find her there, quietly sitting, her expression unreadable, but there was always a softness in her eyes when she looked at him. She had not left his side once since the attack. It was rare for anyone of her rank to spend so much time with a mere guard, yet here she was, her gaze often fixed on him, her thoughts far away. The officer wasn't sure what to make of it. The Queen was a leader, the face of the entire kingdom. She wasn't supposed to get close to anyone. It was a rule, an unspoken one, to keep the distance. But somehow, in the moments when he opened his eyes, she was always there. She had even refused to leave when her advisors urged her to return to her duties. She insisted on staying with him. He was grateful, of course, but also confused. Why? Why had she chosen to be here with him when there were so many others who could have cared for him? There were royal physicians, military officers, and trusted members of the royal family. But it was her, only her. And she didn't seem to mind the hours she spent sitting by his side, waiting in silence. One day, when the officer finally felt strong enough to sit up without feeling dizzy, the Queen was there, as usual. She smiled at him, her usual composure in place, but there was something different in her eyes today. She looked tired, her face drawn, as if the weight of something heavy rested on her shoulders.
"You're awake," she said softly, her voice a little hoarse as though she hadn't spoken in a while.
"How do you feel?" He nodded slowly. "Better," he replied, though he still felt weak. Still not good, but better. She helped him sit up more comfortably, adjusting the pillows behind him. She was gentle with him, as though he were fragile. He was touched by how she treated him, as though he were more than just a soldier. It made him feel important, in a way that no one else ever had. "I can't believe you did what you did," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You threw yourself in front of me, without hesitation." He shrugged, trying to dismiss it. "It's my job. I was just doing my duty." She looked at him, her expression unreadable for a moment, before she shook her head. "It wasn't just your duty. You put yourself at risk. You saved my life without thinking of the consequences." There was a long silence between them. She stared at him, her gaze unwavering, her fingers twisting the edge of her sleeve nervously. The officer felt a strange discomfort at the intensity of her gaze. But he didn't look away. Instead, he focused on her face, watching the way she seemed to wrestle with her thoughts. "You've always been distant from people," she continued, her voice softer now. "You've never allowed anyone to get close. It's easier that way, isn't it? To keep your emotions locked away, hidden. But now I see you for who you truly are. You're not just a soldier. You're more." The officer blinked in confusion, unsure of what she meant. He wasn't sure what she saw in him. To him, he was just a man doing his job, a man who had been trained to protect those in power. "He wasn't anything special. You don't understand," he began, his voice quiet but firm. "I'm just a soldier. I protect the people who matter, the ones who are important." "Buzz?" The Queen shook her head again. "No. You matter. More than you think." She stood up, walking over to the window that overlooked the planet's surface. Her silhouette was framed by the dim light from outside, and she seemed lost in thought. He could feel the tension building in the air, as if she were fighting with herself. He could hear her breathing slowly, deeply, and then she spoke again. "I've never been able to trust anyone fully," she admitted. "But I trust you. For some reason, I do. I can't explain it. Maybe it's because you saved me. Maybe it's because you were the one person who didn't hesitate to act." The officer felt a strange warmth spread through him, and for a moment he couldn't find the right words to say. The Queen trusted him, not because of his title, not because of his rank, but because of what he had done in the heat of the moment. It was a rare gift, and he wasn't sure how to accept it. She turned back toward him, her face serious. "I don't know what I'll do without you," she whispered. "I know it's foolish. But you've become someone I can't imagine being without." Her words hung in the air between them, heavier than anything he had ever felt. The officer had always known his place in life. He was a soldier, a protector, someone who lived by rules and orders. But now, with the Queen's words lingering in his mind, he found himself questioning everything. Could there be something more between them? He had always respected her, but he never thought of her as anything other than his leader. Now, though, there was something different. The way she looked at him, the way she trusted him, he couldn't ignore it. "I'll always be here," he finally said, his voice steady despite the feelings rushing through him. "I'll always protect you," she smiled, a small but genuine smile. It was the first time he had seen her smile without the burden of leadership weighing on her. In that moment, she was just a woman, and he was just a man, and they shared something that was deeper than duty. It was trust, it was loyalty, and it was beginning to become something more. The Queen stayed with him for the rest of the day, talking little but offering her presence, her reassurance, her unspoken promise that he would not face this alone. It was in the silence between them that he began to understand what she meant. He was no longer just a soldier to her. He was someone she had come to depend on. And in that moment he realized that his feelings for her had changed too. As the night fell and the stars outside the window shimmered, the officer closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the day settle into his bones. But there was something else in his chest now, something he had never felt before. It wasn't just the pain from the wound. It was the knowledge that he was important, that he was seen, that the Queen saw him in a way no one else had ever seen him. And for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel so alone. The days passed in a quiet routine, but the officer's mind was far from calm. Each time he woke, each time he caught the Queen's gaze, something shifted within him. It was more than just duty now. He had begun to question his feelings, and with each passing hour, the weight of the connection he shared with her seemed to grow heavier. He wasn't sure what it meant, or even if he should feel this way. But he knew one thing for certain: the Queen needed him, and he was willing to stand by her side no matter what. But the quiet calm would not last. The world they inhabited, one filled with politics, royal duties, and treachery, would soon remind them that peace was fragile. The officer had been recovering steadily, the doctors doing what they could to patch up the wounds. He was still weak, still not fully healed, but he could move about the medical bay now without help. His movements were slow and careful, but he was getting better. One morning he was sitting up in his bed when the door to his room opened. The Queen entered quietly, her steps soft but deliberate. She was no longer the distant ruler he had known from before. She had changed. The walls she had built around herself had begun to crumble, and he could see the real person underneath. The woman who carried a heavy burden but still felt the weight of the world, even in moments of silence.
"I need to speak with you," she said, her voice low but steady.
The officer looked up at her, noticing the way her eyes seemed to darken with concern. Her usual confidence was replaced with something more vulnerable, something that echoed the gravity of the situation. "Of course, Your Majesty, what's wrong?" She walked toward him, her eyes not meeting his as she moved closer. The air between them felt thicker, heavier, as though a storm was brewing. "There's been news," she said, pausing. "A threat. One we didn't expect." His heart sank. He had known that the danger wasn't over, that the assassination attempt was just the beginning. But hearing her voice tremble for the first time was unsettling. She had always been strong, confident, unshakable. But now she seemed different, more human. "A threat?" the officer asked, his voice sharper than he intended. He reached out, his hand brushing the sheets in frustration. He didn't want to show it, but he could feel the anger rising within him. Not at her, but at the situation, at the fact that she was still in danger, still being targeted.
"Yes," she replied, her gaze shifting to the floor.
"The assassination attempt wasn't a random act. We've learned that there are others involved, a faction within the kingdom. They have plans for me, plans to bring down the throne." The officer's heart pounded in his chest. His mind raced with thoughts of how this could have happened, how he had failed to protect her completely. "What are we going to do?" he asked, his voice steady but his mind filled with uncertainty. "We have to act quickly. They are planning something bigger," she said, looking up at him with determination in her eyes.
"But I can't do this alone." Her words hung in the air between them, an unspoken request. She was asking for his help, not as a soldier, but as someone she trusted.
As someone who had already proven his loyalty. The officer felt a surge of emotions, fear, anger, and a deep sense of duty. But beyond all that, there was something else. Something that had been growing ever since the attack. A feeling he couldn't shake, no matter how hard he tried to ignore it. "I'm with you," he said, his voice firm, but this time, it was more than just duty speaking. It was something deeper. A promise. The Queen's eyes softened, her lips curving into a faint smile. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Enough for the officer to understand that his place was by her side. They were in this together now, no matter what. "I need you to stay with me, by my side," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're the only one I trust." The officer nodded, his resolve strengthening. He had made his choice. He had already given everything for her once, and he would do it again. His loyalty was no longer just to the crown. It was to her. The rest of the day passed in a blur of preparations. The Queen's advisors were busy organizing the defense, coordinating with the military, and ensuring that the kingdom's security would hold. But the officer could see the strain in her face. The weight of the throne, the burden of leadership, was taking its toll on her. She had always carried it so gracefully, but now it seemed heavier than ever. That night, as they sat in a war room, the officer stood by her side, silently observing the plans unfolding before them. His eyes scanned the holographic maps, the details of the factions' movements. They were getting closer. He could feel it. The tension in the air was thick, and every minute that passed brought them closer to the inevitable. The Queen glanced over at him, catching his eye for a brief moment. She didn't need to say anything. He knew what she was thinking. This was bigger than both of them. It wasn't just about her survival anymore. It was about the future of the kingdom. And it was about the people who would be affected by their decisions.
"They're going to try something tonight," the Queen said quietly, her voice tense with fear and determination.
I need you to stay close. We can't let them get any closer. The officer gave a small nod.
I'm not going anywhere, he assured her, his voice unwavering. She smiled, a fleeting, sad smile. Thank you. As they prepared for the attack, the officer's thoughts raced. This wasn't just about stopping an assassination attempt. This was a fight for everything they had fought for, everything they had built, and he would protect her, not just because it was his duty, but because he couldn't bear the thought of losing her. The night passed in a blur of action. The Queen remained calm, always a step ahead, as she directed her forces to counter the insurgents' moves. The officer stayed close by her side, watching for any sign of danger. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. The sound of footsteps echoed down the hallways as guards rushed past them, and the soft hum of the ship's alarms made the whole situation feel unreal. But the officer was focused. His mind was sharp. His senses heightened. He wasn't going to let anything happen to her. Not again. The battle lasted for hours, the Queen's forces successfully repelling the attackers and securing the ship. But it wasn't over. The threat was still out there, lurking in the shadows. The officer could feel it, and he could see it in the Queen's eyes. She had been pushed to her limits, but there was no turning back now. As the dust settled and the immediate danger was over, the officer found himself standing at her side once more, watching the quiet aftermath of the battle. The Queen stood tall, her royal composure back in place, but he could see the exhaustion in her face. He could see the toll it had taken on her. "You're safe," he said quietly, his voice filled with both relief and admiration. She turned to him, her eyes softening. "Because of you." The officer gave a small smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "It's my duty." She nodded, but there was something more in her gaze now, something that had been building ever since the attack, something unspoken. They didn't need to say anything. They both knew what had passed between them. The battle may have been over, but the war was far from finished. And no matter what came next, the officer knew one thing: he would never leave her side. The days after the battle were filled with uncertainty. The officer could feel it in the air. The threat had not been completely erased, and the shadow of danger still lingered over them. Though the attackers had been repelled and the Queen's safety secured for now, the officer could sense that there was more to the conspiracy, more pieces of the puzzle they hadn't yet uncovered. The Queen, too, seemed to understand this. She moved through the halls of the royal cruiser with an air of quiet determination, but her eyes, though steady, were heavy with worry. She hadn't spoken much since the battle. The weight of leadership had returned, and the officer knew that her mind was once again focused on the kingdom, on the people who depended on her. He respected her for it, but he couldn't help but wonder how much longer she could carry the burden alone. His thoughts were interrupted when he was summoned to her quarters. The guards at the door let him through without question, and as he stepped inside, he found the Queen standing by the large window, looking out at the stars. There was a calmness about her, but he could also see the exhaustion in her posture, the tightness in her shoulders. "You wanted to see me, Your Majesty?" he asked quietly. She turned to face him, her eyes meeting his with a rare intensity. For a moment, there was a silence between them, one that seemed to speak volumes. Then, in a voice that was soft but firm, she said, "I need your help. There's something I haven't told you." The officer frowned. He had always known the Queen to be open with him, especially after the events of the past few days. She trusted him, and he trusted her in return. But now, there was something in her voice, something that suggested there was more to the situation than she had let on.
"I'm listening," he said, stepping closer to her. "The attackers," she began, her voice trailing off as if she were gathering her thoughts. "They weren't working alone."
We've learned that there's a much larger network behind them, a group within the kingdom itself. People I trusted, people who have been feeding false information, stirring unrest. The officer felt a chill run down his spine. "Betrayal," he whispered, the weight of her words sinking in. She nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving his. "Yes. There are those who would see me removed from the throne, who believe that they could do better.
It's not just about my life anymore, it's about the future of this kingdom.
If we don't stop them, everything we've worked for could fall apart." The officer felt a surge of protectiveness. He had already given everything to protect her once, and he would do it again, no matter the cost. But this
was different. This wasn't just about defending her from an assassination attempt.
This was a fight for the heart of the kingdom itself. "What do you need me to do?" he asked, his voice steady. There was no hesitation in him now. He had made his choice. He would stay by her side, and together they would face whatever came their way. "I need you to help me expose them," she said, her tone resolute.
"We can't let them win, but I can't do it alone."
I need someone I can trust completely. Someone who will stand with me, no matter the danger.
The officer's heart swelled with a mixture of loyalty and something else, something deeper that he couldn't quite place. He had already chosen to protect her. Now, it seemed, he would have to help her fight back against the betrayal that threatened everything they had built.
"I'm with you," he said, his voice unwavering.
"We'll do this together." She looked at him for a long moment, her gaze softening. Then, with a faint smile, she said, "Thank you. I don't know what I'd do without you." The officer didn't respond. There was no need for words. He had made his promise, and he would keep it. Over the next few days, the officer and the Queen worked together in secret, gathering information, making plans. The Queen's advisors were still loyal, but there were whispers in the shadows, signs that some of them were not as trustworthy as they seemed. The officer kept a careful watch on those around them, never letting his guard down, knowing that the danger was far from over. They moved carefully, always staying one step ahead of the conspirators. They couldn't afford to make any mistakes. Every decision they made, every action they took, had to be precise. The officer was there, always at her side, watching her back as she led the charge against those who would tear their kingdom apart. As the days turned into weeks, the tension in the air grew thicker. Every corner seemed to hide a potential threat, every room a place for betrayal. But the Queen never faltered. She remained strong, her resolve unshaken, even as the danger grew closer. The officer couldn't help but admire her. She had always been strong, always been in control. But now, in the face of this threat, he saw a new side of her, a side that wasn't afraid to show vulnerability, a side that trusted him completely. One evening, as they sat in her chambers discussing their next move, the officer noticed the way she looked at him. Her gaze lingered a moment longer than usual, her eyes searching his face as if she were trying to understand something. "You've changed," she said quietly. Since the attack, since everything, you're different. The officer looked at her, unsure of how to respond. He had always been a soldier, always kept his emotions in check, but now, in her presence, it was harder to deny what he had been feeling. There was something between them, something he couldn't explain, but that didn't make it any less real. I'm still the same, he replied, his voice steady, though his heart was beating faster than usual. I'm just doing what I have to do. She smiled, but there was something in the way her lips curved, something that spoke of understanding.
I think you've always known what you had to do, she said softly.
And I think I've always known too. The officer's heart skipped a beat. There it was again. That connection between them. The one that had been growing ever since he had thrown himself in front of the assassin's bullet to protect her. They were no longer just protector and queen. They were something more. As the conversation shifted back to their plans, the officer found it harder to focus. His thoughts kept returning to the queen, to the way she looked at him, to the way his feelings for her had grown over the past weeks. He couldn't deny it any longer. He cared for her, in a way that went beyond duty, beyond loyalty. He cared for her deeply. But for now, there was no time to dwell on it. There were still enemies to face, battles to win. He could think about his feelings later. For now, he had a job to do. And he would do it, no matter the cost.